The next presentation is from the last presentation by Srđan Prodanović and Marjan Ivković, and Srđan is unfortunately not here. Marjan will read it, and it's another one for our pleasure about engagement, although it's called Commitment and Complex Domination, the Emancipatory Potential of Contingency.
Yes, Srđan and I are sociologists, but of kind of, unconventional sort. We are somewhere in between sociology and philosophy. We're half-breeds, as we call ourselves. And we are very interested in the thematic field of social domination, social change, but also contingency. Srđan is a pragmatist. I'm more into critical theory. So the emancipatory potential of contingency, of everyday life, of everyday action. And then, of course, we also explore a little bit social ontological side of these issues. And what I'm going to present today is just a sketch of an argument regarding primarily the perspective of Luke Boltanski, and more specifically his position on critique, where we want to try to find some kind of way of surpassing Boltanski's limitations in understanding the emancipatory potential of contingency of social action. So, to begin with, Boltanski's perspective, you're more or less familiar with it. I'm just going to reconstruct it briefly. His so-called pragmatic sociology is developed on the basis of this fruitful distinction between what he calls the world and reality. And according to Boltanski, reality pertains to those situations that are semantically to some degree certain, in the sense that the occurrence of contingency is manageable with the categorical apparatus which is already present in the given social interaction. So, for example, he says reality tends to coincide with what appears to hang together, in a sense, by its own strength, and is invariably oriented towards permanence, or if you prefer, the preservation of order. So reality coincides with the institutional order of a society. Now, the world, in Boltanski's perspective, pertains to the what he calls the incalculable, so what cannot be integrated into the current schemes of interpretation. So he says something of the world precisely manifests itself every time that events or experiences whose possibility, or in the language of modern governance, probability, had not been integrated into the pattern of reality, make themselves present in speech and or accede to the register of action, whether individual or collective. So Boltanski's argument basically is that the world and reality are incommensurable. There's constantly this kind of contradiction between them, what he calls the hermeneutic contradiction. And the possibility of social change opens up once the reality inevitably gets punctured by the world in the course of everyday social action. Once some social actors experience this hermeneutic contradiction, experience the finitude of institutions, their incapability of dealing with what happens in a concrete interactive situation, the inability of existing institutionalized or culturally prevalent rules of action to basically subsume this interactive situation under themselves. So this differential between world and reality is precisely the vehicle through which, during the course of our everyday life, we basically experience contingency. So we colloquially refer to this differential as unforeseen circumstances, unforeseen consequences of social action. And furthermore, Boltanski's distinction between the world and reality can help us understanding, how social engagement and critique are articulated in the course of everyday social action. So, according to Boltanski, the fact that the contingency of social action is unavoidable has two important implications. First, this already institutionalized semiotic of social action, as he calls it, is always trying to incorporate those new experimental vocabularies which emerge in circumstances in which the world ruptures reality. And this he calls affirmation or domination in a more pronounced sense. So basically, in the course of everyday interaction, when the reality is ruptured by the world, what happens is that this rupture is constantly being interpreted, is being subsumed, is being covered up, is being, as we say, let's call it closed, the closure of the rupture, let's call it that way. And this calls to mind standard social accounts of social dynamics in terms of reform, social reform. So during the course of social life, some of the procedures, protocols, conventions fail us, and upon feeling the unease of uncertainty, we either choose to ignore this, or if the failure is severe enough, we might try to formulate a critique that aims to reveal the inconsistencies of the given procedure. So critique is an essential part of social life, according to Boltanski. It's not something practiced only by intellectuals or by politically engaged actors. It is something that is exercised by everybody. And it's a basic complement of institutional reality. Institutions need critique in order to escape becoming rigid, petrified, incapable of dealing with contingency. But on the other hand, critique undermines institutional reality in the sense that it undermines a given historical formation, and there are certain, you can say, interests in preserving information as it is. In that sense, domination is necessary to neutralize critique to a certain extent, right? Especially to neutralize the kind of critique that Boltanski calls radical critique or metapragmatic critique, which is the kind of critique that does not involve only the understanding that some particular aspect of some institution has failed us, but that the entire institutional reality is in some or another sense insufficient, is inadequate. So these are the metapragmatic critique or the radical critique is the one that Srđan and I are most interested in, and this is where Boltanski gets most confusing and, I would say, unelaborated. So let's first see what domination means in terms of distinction between simple and complex domination in Boltanski. So Boltanski presents domination means neutralization of critique, as I said, of all processes that involve the questioning of the reality of reality, that is, the legitimacy of institutions, and this is done by means of identifying this hermeneutic contradiction that is inherent in every institution, so its inability to completely subsume under itself the contingency of action. If the world permeates reality in a rather dramatic sense, so this rupture is rather pronounced, according to Boltanski, then we move from what he calls the pragmatic register to the metapragmatic one. And in these situations, we have lost pretty much all of the semantic security that was guaranteed to us in practical moments, and so we find ourselves, as he says, head to head with the incalculable nature of the world. So metapragmatic moments, as he says, are those that are marked by an increase in the level of reflexivity, during which the attention of participants shifts from the task to be performed to the question of how it is appropriate to characterize what is happening. So what people are in the process of doing, as if they were doing it together, no longer seems self-evident. This is the metapragmatic situation. Now, Boltanski maintains that the critique that emerges from a metapragmatic situation, critique of institutional reality, has the potential to bring about radical modes of social engagement, which question totality of rules of social interaction, but it is also much more difficult to integrate this critique into the institutional order. So therefore, we have a very, very, let's say, liminal situation in that context. But there are several problems with Boltanski's account of metapragmatically founded critique. So it seems that the more the world permeates reality, the less there is common ground and knowledge between social actors that facilitate the formation of a socially engaged group. And this is exemplified in Boltanski's understanding of the so-called existential test, through which radical critique challenges the validity of the given institutional reality. So existential tests, Boltanski says, must not be regarded as having been subject to a process of institutionalization, so that they retain an individual, or as people say, lived character, even when they affect a large number of people, but each of them taken in isolation. Only their sharing can confer a collective character on them. But how is this sharing attained? How does it come about? That's where Boltanski becomes very, very individualistic. He says, radical critique is frequently based in its early stages on expressions used in forms of creation, such as poetry, the plastic arts, or the novel. As he claims, it cannot be immediately intersubjectively shared. This metapragmatic situation in which the totality of rules of action no longer makes sense. It's always experienced idiosyncratically by isolated individuals, and then he doesn't have a really clear explanation as to how these individual perspectives can aggregate, can coalesce. But he assigns a very important role to theory or to sociology, especially to his brand, pragmatic sociology, in interconnecting these different perspectives that emerge in these situations. So, according to Boltanski, we need sociology to interconnect these instances of emancipation and thus provide fully intelligible radical critique, which is not paternalistic, so it doesn't offer any kind of essentialist accounts of the social reality, doesn't offer any blueprints for social change, but only tries to interconnect these perspectives, systematize them. And it's not epistemologically authoritarian because of this. However, this means the radical critique or the radical social engagement always remains an aggregate of the actor's idiosyncrasies, because these inherently particularistic existential encounters with the world are not mutually shared. Now, Srđan and I consider Boltanski's perspective here inadequate. We would like to propose a preliminary argument as to how this can be expanded, and we would loosely draw on perspectives such as Margaret Gilbert's joint commitment. For example, her argument that joint commitment comes into being when, roughly speaking, each of the parties has expressed his or her personal willingness to be part of it in conditions of common knowledge, and common knowledge between the parties, which is, let's say, can be explained in terms of that the group G internally knows something, internally knows P, or as Gilbert states, if P is out in the open in the group G, and this is something that goes beyond Boltanski's perspective. There's nothing, there is no common knowledge in situations of radical uncertainty regarding the reality of reality. Now, the really interesting question, according to Srđan and me, is the question: can an element from Boltanski's world, so the element that has ruptured the institutional reality, the element of contingency, whatever it is, let's say it's a car collision at the crossroads, which cannot be explained in terms of the existing rules of traffic, or it's the financial crisis of 2008, whether this can become an object of common knowledge in Gilbert's sense. And this question is crucial in light of Boltanski's. It has crucial political implications in our opinion, because Boltanski's argument is that we are today witnessing within contemporary political communities characterized by high degrees of economic development what he calls regimes of complex domination. So while critique exposes the hermeneutic contradiction inherent in every institution, standard domination masks it, as we already said, either through direct repression in very rudimentary or authoritarian regimes, or some form of ideology. Ideological domination would involve, this is not Boltanski's own argument, this is a kind of elaboration of his, would be a semantic incorporation of elements of the world which does not admit that there is a discontinuity between reality and the world. So it still moves within the horizon of masking the hermeneutic contradiction, but in a more sophisticated manner. I'll mention an example a bit later. Complex domination, on the other hand, does not negate the difference between world and reality. This is what is qualitatively new about it. It does not negate the hermeneutic contradiction, but it attempts to show, so these discourses that are involved in complex domination, basically Boltanski refers to as the managerial discourse, or expert discourse, or in the new spirit of capitalism, the project polis. It attempts to show that the institutional reality is perfectly capable of absorbing all elements that emerge from the world without transforming itself radically. And thereby the critique is pretty much disarmed in its standard forms. So complex domination unfolds primarily by means of this expert authority. So every institution is embodied in spokespersons. That is part of its inherent tension, inherent contradiction. So the institutional spokespersons in the case of complex domination are experts who hold this authority, those who have successfully arrogated to themselves an epistemologically privileged position in regards to the contingency itself, the world itself. Various technocrats, let's say managers. When contingency of every interaction ruptures institutional reality under conditions of complex domination, whether it be a car collision or the financial breakdown of 2008, the experts then interpret what has happened, interpret the element of the world that has broken into reality, and determine the right course of institutional modification but never radical transformation, and offer these discursive means for the confused social actors to describe their own situation to themselves more clearly. This is what Boltanski essentially means by the phrase that change becomes both inevitable and impossible under conditions of complex domination. And this is something that we are very intuitively close to us when we think about the current situation in the European Union and everywhere else. It is inevitable change because of the inevitable rupturing of institutional reality by the contingency of the world, and it is impossible because the institutional reality itself accepts the existence of contingency but claims a privileged insight into it, which means that only the existing institutions can be the solution to the problems caused by the world itself. So the 2008 crisis and its aftermath, in our view, exemplify the logic of complex domination in a relatively acute way. We can consider a simple example that illustrates how complex domination works in comparison to ideological domination. Let's say a person X has worked hard all her life, played by all the institutional rules, but loses her job as a result of the crisis, which has nothing to do with her own profession. So something improbable has happened in Boltanski's terms, right? Improbable in the sense that the given institutional regimes of justification or semantics do not foresee such a circumstance, do not allow for it, right? This is not supposed to happen. And the person X does not quite know how to explain to herself with these given resources, symbolic resources. So standard ideological domination would then involve statements such as, for decades, the society in which X lives has lived beyond its means, has spent more than it has produced, which means that, welfare state, the parasites and everything else, immigrants, so that this had to break down eventually, and in the end there is no contingency, right? There is a reason for this crisis which fits into the broader ideological narrative. And now people will have to lose jobs, but the best ones will keep them, so this is a meritocratic narrative. And we have all heard this countless times over the recent years. This is standard ideological domination. So it must in the end be X's own fault that she did not keep her job. And this form of domination can quite easily be theoretically unmasked, can be criticized. Even ordinary social actors can articulate successful critiques by effectively challenging the causal explanation of the crisis and so on and so forth. But complex domination looks somewhat differently. So in this case, it would not negate the contingency of the crisis, and it would not negate the normative deficiency of what has happened to person X. It would involve statements such as, what has happened to X is indeed the product of contingency, of the rupture. The crisis was caused by certain strange economic processes that had nothing to do with her. But, since this rupture is so complex, since it is so complex to comprehend, only certain actors, only the institutional spokespersons, only experts can understand them and devise appropriate solutions that would prevent further injustice, that would restore a certain sense of the reality of reality and eventually restore X's job to her. Now, Boltanski's perspective in our view, manages to correctly grasp this new logic of the mutualization of critique in highly developed contemporary political communities. But Boltanski, let's say in pragmatist terms, Boltanski offers us innovative tools for explaining to ourselves our own feeling of helplessness, of apathy, of the impossibility of radical social change in the contemporary world, epitomized, for example, in the frequent rhetorical question, can we imagine a viable alternative to the market society? Very hard to imagine it really. However, Boltanski's individualism when it comes to the possibility of an intersubjective articulation of radical critique in the context of the radical rupture of reality by the world implies that there really is no way of challenging complex domination, which once again does not resonate with our pre-theoretical intuitions, right? So this is due to the fact that in regimes of complex domination, every rupturing of the institutional reality by the world is immediately interpreted by institutional spokespersons, experts, while on the other hand, so there are generalized narratives about it, while on the, which are not ideological, which are of a new kind, while on the other hand, this macro-structural rupture can only be experienced on the level of the everyday life by individual social actors idiosyncratically, as Boltanski argues, right? There is a certain asymmetry here which makes it impossible to escape complex domination. So in regimes of simple domination, the inability of the institutional reality to react to the rupture in an effective manner otherwise than to negate it in the simplest possible regimes of domination, or to attempt a clumsy ideological explanation, leaves enough room for the actor's idiosyncratic experiences, such as the X's experience of the loss of her job, to somehow gradually become aggregated and for actors to gradually form a radically engaged collective. This would be an initial, let's say, Boltanskian account of the formation of radically engaged revolutionary movements throughout history. But in the regime of complex domination, there simply is no room for this process of aggregation as the institutional reality reacts to the rupture in more effective terms, admits contingency and injustice, but combines it with an expert account of what has happened and a proposition as to how this is to be solved in a manner that is not particularistic but is scientifically grounded and so forth. So it offers to the confused social actors generalized narratives, tools for explaining to themselves their own experiences of existential discomfort before this can be articulated into normative claims. Now, but if we go beyond Boltanski, if we try to argue for example, by means of Gilbert's conception of joint commitment and based on common knowledge that is internal, or let's say some conception of negative intersubjectivity, let's say then we could start understanding the emancipatory potential of contingency in novel terms. Let's say we can imagine, we can, on the basis of these concepts, argue that in a situation of the radical rupture, let's say we have an example of the car collision at the crossroads. If it's a relatively standard collision, we experience the community contradiction, we experience the ineffectiveness of the rules, the traffic rules, and we demand certain kind of reform. But let's say something, a really severe accident happens, we might start feeling that the totality of the rules of interaction does not make sense, that there's something deeply wrong with the social order we live in, there's something deeply wrong with having cars or something like that. Is this only necessarily idiosyncratically experienced by every actor that has witnessed this event? And we would argue it is not. We would argue it is possible to have something like a pre-reflective collective self-understanding as to the fact that this totality of rules does not make sense anymore, which does not mean that we have a positive understanding of what needs to be done. So this is something that is, let's say, a foothold for radical critique under the conditions of complex domination. What Srđan especially calls this common knowledge that the rule R doesn't make sense anymore. And this is the starting point for resisting complex domination, but it's not sufficient. That's where room for, let's say, theory or sociology or science is once again opened, because theory can then have the role that goes beyond Boltanski. It goes beyond just interconnecting different perspectives, actors' perspectives. It can have the role of criticizing ideological narratives, criticizing expert narratives, of keeping open this space of, let's say, negative intersubjectivity, without being epistemologically authoritarian, without proposing what is to be done. So this is only a preliminary argument, and we are open for critique and suggestions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.